Welcome everybody to our new webinar, which today features Dr. Andrew McGarry, whom I will introduce more formally in a moment when we do the proper introduction. Before I do so, I will share my screen here because I have a few introductory notes to make. All right, here we go. Everybody should see the introduction slide, which reads the topic of today's webinar, Making Patients Heard in Clinical Research, the Patient Report of Problems. And as I mentioned, Andrew McGarry is joining us today as the featured speaker and interviewee. He's the Vice President of Clinical Development at Clintrex. And I will talk a little bit about Clintrex as well, and Associate Professor of Neurology at Cooper Medical School of Rowan University in New Jersey. And I'm the CEO and founder of Modality. Most of you will know me. This is what we will do today. We have 45 minutes. I will do a quick introduction of Modality and the prop, and then we will continue on with a full-fledged interview and ask Andrew a number of detailed questions around his specific expertise in the use of patient-reported outcome measures such as the prop, and why those are of importance for clinical research. There's also a question answering round, so please, if you have specific questions you would like to ask Andrew, then feel free to do so by putting them in the Q&A section of the webinar. Now, before going into this interview, a quick reminder. We are talking about clinical trials, clinical research. Many of these trials fail, specifically in Parkinson's disease and in related neurological conditions, which we will talk about today a lot. This is the case. And one of the key issues and causes why failures are happening is, among other things, that assessments of these diseases are very difficult. Usually we talk about, for example, Parkinson's disease, I mentioned, about clinician-administered or patient-administered scales, such as the MDS-UPDRS, which usually happen at the clinic. For example, you see your clinician interviewing a patient. These things happen infrequently. They are very subjective, have significant reliability challenges, which we'll address as well during today's webinar. And therefore, Modality has developed this platform that uses the power of a virtual assistant, virtual guide, Tina, that interviews patients in a way that is very similar to what a neurologist would do in a clinic. So she pays a lot of time listening to the patient and asking patients to describe their problems in their own words. The prop, she also asks patients to go through certain exercises like speaking exercises or facial movement or finger tapping exercises, so we can also quantify function and quantify communication and other traits that are of importance, quantifying the specific progression of the disease and treatment response as well. So speech, language, facial movements, body movements, and the prop, the patient-reported problems, are of importance. This is device independent. No app needs to be installed because it is being done on your own device. You use your laptop, your smartphone, your iPad, anything that's web connected is able to provide these assessments. You do it in the convenience of your own home, mostly. So there's no requirement for the patient to actually come into the clinic, which allows a very accessible and very easy way to obtain these measurements. And that's being used in clinical research. As I mentioned, many clinical trial sponsors are using this technology in their interventional trials and observational studies. So we are in phase 1 through phase 3 studies, in several phase 3 studies, for example, in Parkinson's disease, which we will talk about a lot today. The Michael J. Fox Foundation and also federal agencies have supported this development and research for a long time as well as really big pharma companies as well. You see here, this is being used in multiple disease areas. Parkinson's right at the top. A lot of publications have been done to actually show specifically the patient-reported problems, but also the functional and multimodal measurements I was mentioning to actually show that they are valid clinically and analytically and have strong power of statistics for being used as such assessments. Now, I was mentioning the patient-reported problems, the PROP, a number of times, and that's actually one of the centerpieces of today's conversation. I want to shout out specific recognition, of course, for our inaugural Chief Medical Officer at Modality, Ira Schulzen, who passed away earlier this year. He is the inventor of the patient-reported problems. He's one of the most recognized clinical researchers in Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease as well. And through founding organizations such as the Parkinson Study Group, Huntington Study Group, as well as the Gray Matter Technologies Corporation that Modality acquired 2 years ago, we were able to participate in the fundamental movements he has established. Ira, as well as Lakshmi Abati, our Chief Operating Officer, and Abhishek Hosamath, who is a data scientist at Modality, they are the inventors of the patient-reported problems. It works as follows. Tina asks patients these questions. What bothers you the most with your disease? Very simple. And patients then respond as detailed as they want about that question and talk about their problems, talk about their symptoms, and what makes them better, what makes them worse. And Tina also asks, how does this problem affect your daily functioning? So really reflecting on why that is so important for you as a patient, something that Andrew actually is doing in his daily practice every day. And so examples of responses you see here, someone would say, I'm suffering from tremor, usually mild, but can exacerbate with anxiety or frustration. It affects my daily functioning because it slows down my ability to type on the keyboard, which is essential to my work. Other people have, for example, complained about leg cramps. We have compiled, for example, in collaboration with the Michael J. Fox Foundation, and collected over 600,000 of such responses. And some of them are very, very detailed, with many tens of thousands of different expressions of those symptoms and problems. And this is the machinery which is really underlying the patient-reported problems. So Tina interviews patients, asks these questions, patients respond. They can speak up to 3 minutes for every single question. There's a speech recognizer that transfers these responses into words. We have clinical curators, which are clinical experts or experience experts, patients, that actually review some of these verbatims, some of these reports, and annotate them using a comprehensive set of clinical symptoms that are associated with this disease. Here in this case, Parkinson's disease. You see here on the left, 66 different symptoms and symptom categories that are being distinguished and can be detected by analyzing what patients say in response to Tina's prompts. These curation results are used in order to train a natural language processing and machine learning classifier that is then able to actually label and identify these symptoms automatically when people give responses now. So we can now, at scale, analyze what people are saying and what specific things they are complaining about, automatically with thousands and thousands of different implementations and sessions. Now, this was enough to give you an introduction to what we talk about today, the patient-reported problems. We want to make patients heard. Andrew is a star, making patients heard. I mentioned he's the vice president of clinical development at Clintrex, who's an organization that is helping sponsors of clinical trials to actually get cures and get treatments to patients. They are help companies who are developing, for example, medications and other treatments go through the process of running trials, running research, getting through regulatory approval. Not only is he doing this in practice in numerous phase 1 through phase 3 trials, also overseeing enrollment authorization as chair of safety monitoring committees of multiple organizations, but he's also an associate professor of neurology at Cooper Medical School of Rowan University. When you are blessed enough to actually have him as your doctor, you will have him actually listen to your problems in detail. And I actually went to the website of Cooper University just today and saw some direct responses from his patients that say, Dr. McGarry, as always, takes his time and explains and asks me about what is going on. He's very thorough, kind, and respectful. He explains, listens, and always gives great insight and information. He listens to us. He understands and explains in a normal way. These are all different reviews which I found, and this is really what the prop is about. And now, without further ado, thank you, Andrew, for making time today. And I want to open today's conversation and question and interview by asking you really. I was talking about the prop and how it makes people how it listens to people in an open conversation. But I also mentioned the MDS-UPDRS, which is the typical gold standard scale that is used for developing drugs and also I think in clinical care at times as well. Now, why would we bother using something like a prop that seems to be more complicated and the scale is already well established?
Well, thank you, Diso. That's really kind, that introduction. Thank you so much. And what a great question regarding the way we do things and how we might think about advancing into the future to get perhaps closer to where we want to go. The MDS-UPDRS is certainly a reflection of expertise in phenotype and also elements of function that in its development were carefully considered and thought about to reflect what it is on a regular basis people would pertain to regarding things they have to do and how those things go. So when we think about part 2 and how it assays function, those are reasonable questions that it asks. When we think about part 3, those are certainly features of the phenotype. Those are things that would reasonably translate into problems with function. It hangs together. It's a useful scale. There's a reason why it is the gold standard. It includes non-motor features in part 1. It has provisions for fluctuations in part 1, and part 4 has provisions for fluctuations. So it is a useful tool for what it is that I think traditionally we aim to do, which is try and take the reality of experience and collapse it into something that's understandable using the ordinal scales and figuring that we have the best understanding of how to measure that. Not that we haven't referenced the patients themselves and the development of the scale, that certainly went on, but really what it's trying to do is to fit things into categories, and it asks you to do that. It not only asks you to do that, to perhaps burnish things or configure things or make a decision, a judgment. Is it a 1? Is it a 2? Not only does it make you do that, but it also asks you to do that generally in an environment that is somewhat foreign, if not actually very foreign. So when you think about day-to-day experience, it's already a leap to get someone to come to clinic. Think about all the people who don't even get care. And it is a further leap to have the courage or the interest or the opportunity to then go ahead and participate in a clinical trial, which by definition is an artificial environment. It is technically an experiment. The idea is to collect a sample that, as best as possible, has a mean around whatever outcome measure you have, ideally reflecting mu, underlying reality. Something about reality, hopefully, will shine through in your sample. But it's still a sample, and there's still a question about how adequate it is based on who you select, how they get there, right? Who it is that's showing up, and also the tool you use. So what's really neat about the prop is I think it gets really to the heart of asking the patient how they're doing, period. The sort of Oslerian idea that if you listen, the patient will tell you what is wrong with them. And while it's understandable that scales would be developed to try and collapse these ideas so that they are analyzable, there's something very important potentially missed in doing that, as far as actually hearing what the patient is saying and what they're experiencing. And so really one of the beautiful things about the prop is that people can find a time and a place that suits them under conditions that are optimized, whether they need to think for a minute and reflect, whatever their metacognitive style is. If they aren't really sure and they need a bit more time, they can actually synthesize the best answer to what is bothering them and how that affects their function. That's different than conventionally when people come to us, we don't go to them. We have provisions like the prop through the web. They come to us, we're hoping that conditions are ideal. Usually there's a rigmarole to get to a visit. If there's transportation involved, you're hoping that someone is in a good frame of mind. You're hoping they've reflected on things and they are asked on the spot, for the last week, how did things go? You have to collapse a week of information that you may or may not have thought about, and to some degree may or may not be wholly aware of in that environment, and answer the question. So what the prop is allowing us to do is to bypass some of these limitations that we might encounter in conventional style clinical trials. And it offers an opportunity to really enrich the data set about what the patient experience actually is and how it influences their function.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I was wondering also, because we recently discussed about the MDSU PDRS and looked through the specific instructions and counted the number of words in the instructions of the scale. And it was, I think, exceeding 1,000. So several thousand words, I think, in the instruction of the MDSU PDRS as compared to what bothers you the most. So that, and this reminded me of what Ira was saying also about informed consent forms and other things. So when you speak to patients, you want to be as clear and as simple as possible. So some of your patients clearly said that about you also, because you need to, as a physician, I suppose, when you speak to a patient, you want to be understandable by them. You want to use language that resonates and that translates the specific complicated underlying phenomena to how they understand them. And so what bothers you the most is really straightforward and then opens, and we have seen this in studies over and over, that people then really start talking in detail about a lot of things that may not be that relevant, but a lot of things are very relevant.
It's a great point. When you think about giving someone a minute to organize internally how they are meant to answer the question, you learn a lot when you ask in an open-ended way. And so there's a set of things that we want to know about that pertain to the phenotype and functions that we might think are universally important to ask about, so-called activities of daily living. Generally speaking, if you can prepare meals, if you can toilet, if you can get dressed, hygienic tasks, maneuvering around the house, these are all things that generally people would find reasonably important. And asking about them is certainly something on our list to get an idea. Hey, your baseline human functions, how are they going? But if you only stopped at that, you're not really getting at the richness of the person's experience that might otherwise be an important outcome measure for whether your intervention is actually useful. And that is a very custom thing. Humans are unique. So if you give them a chance to say what it is that's bothering them and let that come out however it's going to, the beauty of the language processing and the AI learning is that the tool, I think, as a non-AI guy, but really fascinated by it and grateful to learn from you and your team about it as we go. I think what's really neat about that is if there are things that seem less relevant to the disease in question, you would imagine you'd be able to still categorize those, because whether they're relevant or not is still something of an assumption when you are trying to learn. There will certainly be the things that will come out that will feel intuitive. Tremor for Parkinson's, handwriting for Parkinson's. It's commonly something that shows up on part 2 that bothers people. Falling. Those things will certainly fall out. But what's so cool about letting people just tell you, and then you analyze it, is that's how you learn things that you may not even thought you know, or should know, or would expect to look for. So it's really beautiful that you can analyze the data and learn things just by letting people tell you. And so in a large enough sample, I have a feeling that we're going to learn a whole lot, as we have already. We'll learn a whole lot more going into the future that we would have never thought of per se.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. When you look here on the left, when I talked about the specific symptoms that we are now distinguishing in Parkinson's disease, these are now 66. It used to be a much smaller number. So when the whole project took off and we looked into the UPDRS and other lists of typical symptoms of Parkinson's disease, and it was, I think, counting up to something like 40 or so. But just by running and letting people speak, there's more and more you discover, and that you then add to that list. I want to tell you just very briefly that the prop, even though it is used mostly in Parkinson's disease today, it's also used in other diseases. We ran it, for example, in this study at the Veterans Administration for mild cognitive impairment. And so typical cognitive scales would have been applied to identify whether people have, what state in their cognitive decline are they currently residing. Now, what was surprising by applying the prop was, in this case, that, for example, many people complained about falling. That actually the chance of falling in people with mild cognitive impairment was significantly elevated compared to people of the same age or gender that were healthy. And so those things you would normally not think of necessarily. And it was something that was somewhat surprising, but then actually not surprising when you think about it. But this is actually something that allows you to discover things, effects, problems, and experiences that you would normally not necessarily tie to a specific disease, or maybe in a disease agnostic way also to your general well-being.
Really well said. Yeah, you can imagine a cognitive visit for MCI focusing on typical cognitive things, worrying about driving, worrying about self-care. Do you have support from the family nearby? Are you still working? Has there been a decrement in performance in these different domains? Cognitive. Not necessarily, unjustified, certainly, but the idea that you would then make an adjacent consideration to things that actually require a deceptive amount of, say, attention or cognitive ability, paying attention to surveil your environment and avoid obstacles, having enough executive function to make a judgment about whether a surface is unstable for you. Is it wise to climb the ladder and pull the leaves out of the gutter when there's a 20 mile an hour wind? All of these things that sort of roll into what it means to be cognitively intact. On top of the fact that, as best as I know, when I looked, there's nothing about surveillance for falling in the formal guidelines for MCI. And so, case in point, the experts who know so much about MCI and have lots of clinical experience would not have really necessarily known to make that adjacent maneuver and say something about falling, because there may not have been a ton of data necessarily to do that. We know as people advance on that spectrum, things like falling become more common, but it isn't obvious enough to have it in the guidelines at the moment. So this is a very powerful opportunity to maybe look at things that are happening sooner than we think, maybe falling in MCI, or actually more important than we think from a clinical point of view, more meaningful to people. So you can imagine this even translated into general care in that way, guideline changes and so on.
Yeah, it's really, I have more questions about this, but there's already some good activity here in the public room. I want to see to what indications has the prop been applied so far. We just mentioned a couple. So Parkinson's disease was the first indication, followed by Huntington's disease. We also have applied it to multiple sclerosis and MCI. We are now applying it also to ALS, and we will expand the usage of the prop because of what we just talked about, which is it's really universally applicable. Of course, every disease is different, but the data that we've collected with Parkinson's is a really good starting point, also for other neurological diseases, for example. what's the cost of running prop in a clinic for a new indication, such as NeuroPass, PASC. I don't even know what that indication is. Do you know that, Andrew? NeuroPass?
Maybe our attendee could clarify for us. Yeah, I'm not sure offhand.
And it's, first of all, the prop is currently not used in clinical care and healthcare. It is exclusively used in clinical research. So it is being used in interventional and observational studies to measure effects of disease progression and treatment response. But of course, there's pricing associated with this. Feel free to reach out to me if you have specific pricing questions, and we can give you information about this. And the other question is, can the prop also capture HEOR type data from doctor visits, other healthcare organizations? And again, I'm not positive what that is. Would you know, Andrew? HEOR?
Healthcare utilization, you wonder about payer-related things, but maybe our attendee can also clarify. Thank you to the other attendee who made mention that PASC pertains to long COVID, and it's an interesting idea.
That's actually a good question. I wasn't aware that this is the post-acute sequelae of COVID. Yes. So in fact, we are starting to work on long-haul COVID with the Veterans Administration and also with a biotech company that is about to start a phase 1b clinical trial in long-haul COVID where the prop is going to be administered. So yes, so that's one of the indications in which we are now going into as well. And pediatric
economics. Oh, sorry, Dave.
Yeah, so for pediatric applications, the only one we've been going into so far, there's been a couple, but the strongest was autism spectrum disorder. However, we have not applied the prop to neither the patient, the child, nor the parent thus far. So no use of the prop, use of visual facial measures as well as speech measures, yes. Oh, it's healthcare economics, as you said, healthcare and economics and outcomes research. So no, we haven't used the prop for that purpose just yet. The prop has been used for disease-specific question, like for example, what is the most bothersome problem with your Parkinson's disease? We also ask about general health. What is your most bothersome problem with your health in general and your personal well-being also? So these three domains are sometimes distinguished, and in most cases today we just ask the question, what is your most bothersome problem, period, and no other additional more detailed disease-specific questions.
It's a fascinating consideration, just thinking about that for a moment, David, where if you were able to predict things that have high economic relevance, like falls and attendant hospitalizations or healthcare utilization, even in urgent care, or number of outpatient visits, if the digital signature in combination with people reporting on what's bothering them as an ongoing clinical experience, in a matter of speaking, you can imagine that potentially being used from a screening point of view or a preventative point of view. It might be a little bit on the drawing board at the moment, but to this question, this very good question about healthcare economics and outcomes, things that drive cost are commonly big ticket items like falls and hospitalizations. And if there are ways to identify problems about to mount and intervene in a less expensive way or a more efficient way, one can imagine that that might be possible. It's a great question.
Yeah, it's a good question, specifically for other market segments that this technology can be applied for. We are relatively narrow right now. It is really in clinical research, reason really being that it is a very relatively new instrument that is being validated, and validation usually happens through clinical research and observational studies, but now also as endpoints in interventional trials. And one of the questions is actually about this as well. How has the EMA and the FDA seen the prop currently in clinical trials for neurological diseases. The status of the prop, as well as the other functional audiovisual measures, is that they are exploratory endpoints today. They're being used as exploratory endpoints in various types of trials for various purposes. When you're in an early stage trial, say a proof of concept phase 1b or phase 2a study, then it is often used for what we talked about earlier, to really understand what is happening with the patient under the influence of the new candidate medication, and you want to see what sort of positive or negative changes are emerging, ones that you may not have thought about. So the prop gives you a pretty comprehensive picture of the experience of patients and how it changes over time. Now with later stage trials, say phase 3 study, the opportunity is that changes that you see that are manifested in the prop and also the audiovisual measures can support the case that you're making to the EMA or FDA as supportive evidence in addition to the primary or secondary endpoint data that you will provide. And this package as a whole should give you a very strong evidence for the effect that the drug is making. So it's almost like an insurance policy that gives you a really comprehensive picture of how your medication affects your patients in your trial.
And you can imagine that, David, being very powerful, where on one hand you have a biomarker-driven digital signature that, if validated, is correlating to what would be thought of as improvement or reflecting formal improvement. That by itself is powerful. So you might imagine detecting small amounts, very useful amounts of how much. And then on the other hand, you couple this with the very powerful idea that the so what via the patient report outcome. Putting those two things together, you can imagine being compelling. So you have a more objective tool-based way via the digital metrics to show improvement, ideally. And also, if that correlates to someone substantiating that in their experience, you have two lines of evidence that are converging. And that's really quite powerful to think about, being able to do that.
It's very powerful because the regulators, they care about how patients, what patients experience, how they function, how they survive, right? And the prop addresses definitely how they feel, and also how they function partially. And the other measures that you mentioned that are, for example, about your communication, about your facial movements, they are mostly about how you function. So this combination gives you a pretty comprehensive view on various aspects, on actually very important aspects to what the regulators care about. Which brings us to this other question about clinical meaningfulness, which is also something that the regulators strongly care about. We hear this all the time from sponsors of clinical trials. How do you think about the prop as supporting clinical meaningfulness, or whether it is clinically meaningful in its own? What's your opinion about this?
I would tend to think that it's probably as close as you can get, in part because it's directly from the source. So what the person is doing and reflecting is giving an opinion on the things that furnish well-being, a sense of competency, agency, however one might look at, feeling that you have an understanding internally of what's meaningful to you. It really bears reflection on what that actually means. And knowing that that will vary from person to person to some degree. There are universal elements to, feeling capable in life that all humans share, and certainly improving those if they're part of a disease state is likely to be meaningful, but not necessarily. And so one nice thing about asking the patient to reflect on this is that you hear directly from the source. And really what you're trying to do is see how people are, in the course of receiving an intervention, improving in a way that they can detect that they value, compared to a way that we can detect and that we value. There is overlap, but that does not have to be 100%. And part of our failing, I think, in reflecting on, well, these scales that we make and the way that we do things there's probably something we're missing about how to rightfully understand meaningfulness. So going right to the source, again, in that Oslerian way, seems like a very good way to do things.
Yeah, and nothing is perfect, but the combination of, for example, what patients say with what they do, which is also one of the inventions of Ira Scholzen, measure what patients say and do. So that's what we do in this combination here. Is very important, not only for the regulators. Speaking of regulators, someone mentioned also not only the FDA and the EMA care, but the CMS and other involved agencies may also care, and that is completely true. So, for example, and it was also mentioned by sponsors that use us specifically in phase 3 studies, that they also want to collect this additional evidence, specifically the opinion of end users, of patients. For example, to provide this extra data to CMS for label claims, or also to get for negotiations for pricing, other things like this, which may be of relevance. And the question of another attendee is about whether such a system can quantify or detect depressive and anxiety in patients. Yes, well, going back, and I may be able to share my screen very quick here, because it was one of those. When you look at the specific problem set that I mentioned before, this is for Parkinson's disease again, but it's very similar to other diseases we're looking at. You have actually specific symptoms that are around mental conditions, such as anxiety, depressive symptoms, apathy, loneliness, negative emotions, for example. So these domains are covered by the prop as well. So when people complain or bring these up as important problems, which does happen very frequently, actually very frequently in Parkinson's disease. The good thing is, and I invite you to look at the numerous papers that have been presented and published by our collaborators and us, numerous collaborators such as University of Rochester, University of Toronto, and others on the prop. You will see the specific distributions of these problems. For example, the population of the Michael J. Fox Foundation, which is over 30,000 patients that we have looked at longitudinally over more than 5 years. So this is a very large data set. We're talking about a very large data set that constituted the foundation of how the prop came into being. And of course, through this vast data set that was compiled, we have a very strong or a very reliable distribution of these symptoms and how they change over time. And one can look, and you can look actually by yourselves in these publications to identify, for example, how often certain symptoms get associated with disease state, for example. And another attendee is asking whether the prop is available in other languages, and whether this has been investigated as well. The answer is yes. So these trials that we're talking about here, they are usually specifically the later stage trials. They are multi or international trials. They often start off in the United States, often in Canada, and then in the European Union as well. We are now expanding into South America. We have been in Australia as well. So there's many different countries, many different languages, which this is deployed in. And Asia, not quite yet, but we are looking at a first sponsor from South Korea, and we're talking to Japan as well. So those would probably be the first Asian candidate countries that we're going to expand to as well. It's going to be very interesting. We do have international data for functional measurements, speech measurements, facial measurements, quite a lot already, and so those comparisons do exist. For the prop itself, I'm also very curious to see how specific cultural differences and the way people express themselves varies. from these in these different countries. Now, speaking about other diseases, also we have other countries, but we also spoke about other diseases. And now I want to hear your personal opinion because you see patients from quite a number of different diseases. You're expert in PD and in HD, but I know that you've seen patients also in other neurological diseases. How would you see the prop being deployed, and maybe just a general prop where you're asking what's your most bothersome problem? And is it feasible, in your opinion, to come up with a general prop that is applicable to all the diseases you see? Or is it important to have disease-specific ones?
I could see both. You might imagine, depending on the question that's being asked or the information desired, that you would use a disease-specific prop. Perhaps if there was something in particular that you thought your intervention excelled at, and you wanted to be sure that you captured that and allied things around it. So imagine you had an intervention for sleep and all the things that are allied to an improvement in sleep, like mood and cognition. Now you can imagine that being a bit specific to a given disease, depending on whether it's primarily amnestic, say the cognitive question, or primarily executive. So it could be fairly granular, I think, with the disease-specific ones. The general ones also seem very useful in part because, diseases live in close company to other diseases. And as people go through life, you're allowed to accumulate as many problems as you'd like. And unfortunately, people commonly have numerous diseases. How they influence each other and how one experiences numerous diseases would seem to be an interesting data set that might emerge from a general prop, where there might be something about relationships between diseases that are very important that we don't think about. So if you're a neurology guy and you're seeing someone who has diabetes or rheumatoid arthritis, it may not be immediately obvious, although hopefully somewhat thought-provoking, that if you have neuropathy and if your gait is asymmetric because your joints hurt, your fall risk is going to be different than someone who does not have neuropathy from their diabetes or who does not have arthritis. And so thinking on how these things are present and whether they're controlled feels like a broader view and probably allows you to penetrate the more synthetic phenotype, where your understanding of their experience, truly illness, is probably greater compared to diseases in silos, where you're not necessarily thinking systemically. There's a world of difference between disease and illness. And something about the illness experience is probably waiting to be discovered, or at least accentuated earlier to benefit earlier interventions, better understanding, better care. That's probably waiting to be found with the device, like a general prop.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There was another question by one attendee here about a prop that can be applied several times a week in order to detect quick changes. We usually deploy the prop itself only in several weeks or sometimes even several months time intervals. However, the specific functional measures, the audiovisual measures, communication measures, and so on, they are often deployed more frequently. So either every week, in some cases even more frequently, to determine quicker changes, as you mentioned. The responses, the verbal responses, they are not as sensitive to like smaller and rapid changes as the ones that I mentioned that are more functional audiovisual. So this combination is usually key. The prop we would usually deploy once a month or once every other month, while the audiovisual measures, these say speaking exercises or finger tapping exercises, they would be deployed much more frequently. And we are running against the time, but I wanted to ask you one final question. What do you see as the future of the prop? It's a current state right now, exploratory endpoint in interventional trials and used in many observational studies. But what's coming next in your view?
What a cool question. I think broader capability probably in terms of the digital signature. You can imagine even using the full weight of a personal device like an accelerometer or a camera to do other things. You can imagine maybe some clever way to assay gait. We worry about gait a lot. We worry about falling a lot. So I think there's, if one were at the drawing board, one would wonder about maybe some of those ways to expand it. I think access is also one of the really incredibly potent qualities to this platform because it's web-based. And so when we think about how hard it is to get to people who need care, while it is a research tool, one would wonder whether it has advantages, even in clinical care down the road, where if someone has very limited access to care, I think of our own field, there are so few movement disorder neurologists as it is. There are relatively few neurologists in general. And everybody, as the population ages, will be calling on this particular field to do more and more. And they don't always have access to what they need. So if there's a way to get into the home, that you can imagine it being akin to telehealth in some ways, but perhaps more directed, where you have Tina and the digital signature perhaps being useful as a warning of some sort or an index of progression in conjunction with what people are saying. So not only are you getting the report from them, but you're also getting a digital signature that may be of predictive value, that reifies maybe what you're hearing, where if all of that is consistent and hanging together, now maybe there's something treatment-wise that you act on. Maybe it helps you make treatment decisions because you have this biomarker signal telling you something is happening. And that might be especially valuable if the person in that particular state of unwellness may not give you the usual richness in the prop. So you can really see internally a prop signal for a given person that might vary as a function of illness. And you can imagine the digital signature also potentially helping you in that regard too. It's just lends itself to so many interesting potential applications, I think.
Well, thank you, Andrew. We are being asked this all the time. When are you going to help in healthcare as well? Because there's such a need and such a utility as well. We're definitely considering this. It's not quite time yet, as we are focusing on research and we'll uncover and validate all these measures to be prepared for the time when this is rolled out at scale. I want to thank you, wholeheartedly for making time today, Andrew. This was a great conversation. I'm looking forward to talking to you next week about more of these things. And there's going to be another webinar coming up in about a month from now. You will hear from us. So please look at your email. In a couple of weeks, you will be invited. And Andrew, thank you so much. You have a good rest of the day and good weekend, everybody. And we see each other soon.
Thank you, David. Such a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.